One Sabbath, while Jesus was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked some heads of grain and rubbed them in their hands and ate them. But the Pharisees, who naturally don't like much of anything Jesus does, those Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And Jesus answered, "Have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry?" Remember a couple of weeks ago when we read that? He entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, "The Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath." The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever. Would you pray with me? Spirit of God, would you take this ancient text and help us to recognize what it might challenge us to do in this day and age. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. It's not just that the world is changing, right? It's the pace of change, and we've been saying that now for decades. The pace of change is extraordinary, and it has a real impact on us. I think we could see that when COVID just smacked us in the face, this huge change, and it really disrupts our life. Change disrupts life, and it can make us pretty anxious. And this has been going on now for decade upon decade upon decade, from the industrial age forward, really. It disrupts us, it concerns us, we become afraid and anxious. Invention after invention after invention, even if they're good, they start to shift things so much we hardly know whether we're coming or going. My dad, as you know, is 105 years old. The amount of change he's seen in his life, he talks about it. It's extraordinary. And it impacts our society. We've invented something, the internet, that we don't even understand what it is. No wonder we're concerned. The reality is that under those circumstances, society tends to devolve. When people get anxious, society tends to devolve. The evolution of government, for instance, is what brought us democracy. Democracies all over the world sprung up as people began to advance in their understanding of how we might rule one another. But with all this anxious feeling in the world, it's like we're going backwards towards authoritarianism. Right now, it's just hints, movements, enough to raise our eyebrows, that's for sure. We don't exactly know where it's going, but it does seem to me to be a part of this anxiety that comes from enormous change. Because the reality is that when we're anxious, the circle of care that we have shrinks. The people that we care about, the number of people shrinks. Sometimes it can shrink down to just our family or even just ourselves. Maybe we care about our town, but do we care about our state? Maybe our state, but our nation, but the world? It shrinks the more afraid we get and the more anxious we get. And the reality is that the only way to overcome that kind of contraction is to be transformed spiritually, to be living out of the love of the universe that breathes and moves through us. And yet that's not happening because even our faith is contracting these days. So often the church is paying attention to what God can do for us. Isn't that the case? Too often we think about, what can God do for me? We're looking to put our behavior in shape so that God might be pleased with us and God could do something for me. Circle of care shrinks. Our efforts to get to know God shrink. We care what God can do for us rather than seeking God so that our purpose in life can be derived from a relationship to the one who brings creation into being. It's difficult. It's partly why the church is shrinking. I mean, after all, we don't seem to be transformed by the presence of God because that takes an enormous amount of work. I don't know if you read David Brooks this week in the Times. He was talking about what's happening, particularly in the evangelical church. He says that the kids are leaving, you know. You know why the kids are leaving? It's not because they don't believe what the church teaches. They're leaving because they don't think that the church believes what the church teaches. That quote just smacked me in the face. Russell Moore, Southern Baptist Convention, is the one who said that. It's really striking. Last week I had a meeting with a couple of people. We're going over new language for our website. You know, what do we want to say to other people about who we are and how we want them to join us? We talked about a couple of things, and one of the copywriters says, well, could we use words like raising consciousness and transformation? And we decided maybe not. That's a little too woo-woo for this congregation. Yeah, it is. It's a little too woo-woo for this congregation, and that concerns me a bit. The kids are leaving. Just a few years ago, when I know most of these young people now, I was asked to find a place for a group of 20-somethings to have a book group. It was a spiritual group, definitely not Christian. They were from what I call the integral world. And I had a place where I could host them, so in they came, about 15 of them, maybe 18. And just as a kickoff, the leader of the group said, well, I'm wondering if each of you could tell us what your daily spiritual practice is. Every single one of them had an answer to that question. I got a feeling that if we asked the same question of this group, probably wouldn't get an answer from everybody like that. It's like spirituality, spiritual transformation, consciousness raising isn't exactly on the table, which is odd because it's the only thing that can transform us sufficiently to be able to navigate this huge change and deal with the anxiety we have in the midst of it. It's certainly the way Jesus operated. We talked about that inaugural dream he had a couple of weeks ago. That required 40 days of fasting and being alone in prayer in the wilderness. And we will find in the Gospel of Luke that at every major turn, Jesus sits in prayer really for all night. You don't think he's talking to God that whole time, saying what God should do for him. No, he's communing in the presence of God. He is being spiritually transformed and guiding us and wanting us to do it. But while I'm asking those kids what their daily spiritual practice was, and each of them had an answer, I was at a church where we had a contemplative service at 8:30 in the morning. And that meant we had 5 minutes of silence. Can you imagine 5 minutes of silence in a worship service? I was trying to work it up. I'd gotten to 7 and I was getting a hard time about it. It's really quite an indictment on the church that we're not connecting to the presence of God and seeking God's transformation. It's quite an indictment of the church, and it makes me squirm too, because I do not believe that I have the kind of spiritual life that I need to have. And if I were you, I'd be squirming right now, except that I know what I'm going to say next. What I'm going to say next is this: to have a deep spiritual transformation, to connect to God on a regular basis, really can't be done alone. Just can't be done alone. We need the social support. And so right now, our church is in the middle of a secular society that gives no support whatsoever. It's no wonder that spiritual practice has fallen out. I'll tell you, it's why I wish I was a Jew. I really do wish it. Because built into the center of Jewish life is the Sabbath. And the Sabbath has the potential to be a spiritually transforming practice that recenters the life on the presence of God and enables people to hold themselves in a productive and loving way through the midst of all of that change and anxiety. It's built into life. I really do wish it. It is sufficient for raising consciousness. But it's hard for us to understand how. I'm not sure that we even have an image of what a life transformed and centered on spiritual practice would look like. Those of you who took my Bible class on the Ten Commandments have heard of a little book by Abraham Heschel called The Sabbath. It's really the book on Jewish American spirituality. And because it so beautifully paints a picture of what this practice can do for a family, for a people, how it can draw them into the presence of God and stabilize them, I'm going to read a fair amount of the introduction of this book. And I'm not going to do it because I expect you to keep the Sabbath after we leave here today. That's not why I'm doing it. I'm doing it because I'd like to paint a picture of what it might look like to be transformed by the presence of God. Because there are other ways than keeping the Sabbath that we could choose, that we could reach to. Mostly I'm going to be reading from the introduction to the 20th anniversary edition. It's written by Heschel's daughter, Susanna. And she describes just what it was like to grow up in her father's house. When my father raised his kiddish cup on Friday evenings, closed his eyes, and chanted the prayer sanctifying the wine, I always felt a rush of emotion. As he chanted with an old sacred family melody, he blessed the wine and the Sabbath with his prayer, and I also felt he was blessing my life and that of everyone at the table. I treasured those moments. Friday evenings in my home were the climax of the week, as they are for every religious Jewish family. My mother and I kindled the lights for the Sabbath, and all of a sudden I felt transformed emotionally and physically. After lighting the candles in the dining room, we'd walk into the living room, which had windows overlooking the Hudson River, facing west, and we would marvel at the sunset that soon arrived. The sense of peace that came upon us as we kindled the lights was created, in part, by the hectic tension of Fridays. Preparation for that holy day, my father often said, was as important as the day itself. During the busy mornings, my mother shopped for groceries, and in the afternoons, the atmosphere grew increasingly nervous as she cooked. My father came home from his office an hour or two before sunset to take care of his own preparations. And as the last minutes of the work week came to a close, both my parents were in the kitchen frantically trying to remember what they might have forgotten to prepare. Had the kettle boiled? Was the black covering the stove? Was the oven turned on? Then suddenly it was time. 20 minutes before sunset. Whatever hadn't been finished in the kitchen, we simply left behind as we lit the candles and blessed the arrival of the Sabbath. My father writes in this book, the Sabbath comes like a caress, wiping away fear, sorrow, solemn memories. Indeed, on the Sabbath, my father's reading habits even shifted. He did not read secular books, works of philosophy, or politics, but instead turned to Hebrew religious texts. Because writing is forbidden on the Sabbath, he would sometimes place a napkin or a paper clip to mark the page so that years later I could tell which books he'd been reading on the Sabbath. Shabbat lunch, too, was informal and lighthearted, a time for joking and teasing. After lunch, my parents took their weekly nap, followed by tea and a walk in Riverside Park across the street. There we would meet friends and colleagues, taking their Shabbat afternoon strolls. There are really two kinds of Shabbat experiences. Those of the fall and winter months when Sabbath begins around 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon and ends 5 o'clock on Saturday. And those of the spring and summer when the Sabbath starts at 8 or 8:30 and ends at 9 o'clock or even later. In the winter months, our Friday nights continued long after dinner as my parents sat at table drinking tea and reading. During the spring months, the long Shabbat afternoons became the peaceful and quiet focus of our day. Often my parents would invite students for a Shabbat afternoon high tea. My mother served cheese and crackers, various cakes, sometimes even a magnificent heron tort, a loaf of bread sliced lengthwise and filled with layers of various kinds of fish and egg salads and frosted with cream cheese and anchovy spread. I got to tell you, this is when I don't wish I'm Jewish. My father was attentive to each student, asking about his studies, hometown rabbis, the goals for the future. As the afternoon turned dusky, he offered each one a seder. That's the prayer for the evening service. Together we made Havdalah, the prayer concluding Shabbat, and the students departed. Everywhere we went, we celebrated Shabbat. Nearly every summer, my parents rented a house in LA to be near my mother's brothers and their families. The houses were occasionally too far from a synagogue to walk, so friends would come to my parents' home for services in Shabbat morning. My mother would prepare a light kiddush for everyone, and guests stayed well into the afternoon. By the time the Sabbath ended on Saturday night, it was late, and we went to sleep. This book, The Sabbath, appeared at a time when American Jews were assimilating radically and when they were embarrassed by public expressions of Jewishness. Seems sometimes like there's a parallel in the Christian church now. And even among rabbis and Jewish leaders, a rejection of Jewish mysticism, woo-woo-ness, Hasidism, and even a theology and spirituality was common. It was as if they desired a religionless Judaism, a Judaism without God or faith or belief. For them, the Sabbath interfered with jobs, socializing, shopping, and simply being American. In trying to reintroduce the importance of the Sabbath, my father did not berate the Jews for their neglect of the religious observance, nor did he demand obedience to Jewish law based on an absolute authority of rabbinic texts. Writing in an era in which books by clergy advocating the psychological health promoted by religion were coming into vogue, my father went against that trend, much like Martin Luther King Jr. did a couple of weeks ago. He insisted that the Sabbath is not about psychology or sociology. It doesn't serve to make us calmer or to hold the family together, nor does the Sabbath represent a rejection of modernity or the secular world. No, for him, the Sabbath was a complement to building civilization, not a withdrawal from it. In contrast to more recent approaches to the Sabbath, my father did not emphasize the importance of ritual. In fact, he believed that words, customs, and ceremonies should be eradicated from the Jewish vocabulary. Nor did he view the Sabbath as a vehicle for solidifying Jewish continuity. Yet my father's approach to the Sabbath did reflect some of the political concerns and language of his day. The themes of freedom and liberty recur in this book. He writes that we need the Sabbath in order to survive civilization. He says, gallantly, ceaselessly, quietly, man must fight for inner liberty, to remain independent of the enslavement of the material world. Inner liberty depends upon being exempt from the domination of things as well as the domination of people. There are many who have acquired a high degree of political and social liberty, but only very few are not enslaved to things. This is our constant problem. How to live with people and remain free. How to live with things and yet remain independent. My father defines Judaism as a religion centrally concerned with the holiness of time. Some religions build great cathedrals or temples. But Judaism constructs the Sabbath as an architecture of time. Creating holiness in time requires a different sensibility than building a cathedral in space. We must conquer space in order to sanctify time, my father said. And sanctifying the Sabbath is part of our imitation of God, but it also becomes our way into the presence of God. How do we bring about the elusive atmosphere that is the Sabbath? Sanctity is a quality my father emphasized that we create. We know what to do with space, but how do we shape sacred time? 6 days a week, we live with the fury of acquisitiveness. Shabbat, he writes, renews the soul and we rediscover who we are. The Sabbath is the presence of God in the world open to the soul of man. God is not in things of space, but in moments of time. So how do we perceive God's presence? There are some helpful Sabbath laws, those that require shutting off secular demands and refraining from work. In enumerating the categories that constitute work, the Mishnah, that's ancient Jewish text, the Mishnah describes types of activities necessary to build technological civilization. And my father goes further. Not only is it forbidden to light a fire on the Sabbath, he writes, ye shall kindle no fire, not even the fire of righteous indignation. In our home, certain topics were just avoided on Sabbath: politics, war in Vietnam, even the Holocaust, while others were emphasized. Observing the Sabbath is not only about refraining from work, but about creating menuah, a restfulness that is also a celebration. Sabbath is a day for body as well as soul. It is a sin to be sad on the Sabbath, he said. It's a lesson he repeated and often observed. With the Sabbath comes a miracle. The soul is resurrected, an additional soul arrives, and the effulgence of Sabbath holiness fills every corner of the household. Anger is lifted, tensions are gone, and there's a glow on the face. Creating Shabbat begins with a sense of longing. Strikingly, my father turns our expectations around. It is not we who long for the day of rest, but the Sabbath spirit that's lonely and longs for us. We are the mate of the Sabbath. And each week, through our sanctification of the Sabbath, we marry the day. That marriage, like any marriage, shapes us. Who we are and what we are depends on what the Sabbath is to us. Similarly, the Sabbath does not simply come into being on Saturdays. The depth of its experience is created, he writes, by how we behave on the other 6 days of the week, for they are all a pilgrimage to Sabbath. Shabbat comes with its own holiness. We enter not simply a day, but an atmosphere. My father cites the Zohar, a mystical text. The Sabbath is the name of God. We are within the Sabbath rather than the Sabbath being within us. For my father, the question is how to perceive that holiness, not how much to observe or how to observe. That's what the Pharisees got wrong. Strict adherence to the laws regulating Sabbath observance don't suffice. The goal is creating Sabbath as a foretaste of paradise. The Sabbath is a metaphor for paradise and a testimony to God's presence. In our prayers, we anticipate a messianic era that will be a Sabbath. And each Shabbat prepares us for that experience. Unless one learns how to relish the taste of Sabbath, one will be unable to enjoy the taste of eternity in the world to come. It was on the seventh day that God gave the world a soul, and the world's survival depends upon the holiness of the seventh day. The task, he writes, becomes how to convert time into eternity, how to fill our time with spirit. 6 days a week, we wrestle with the world, bringing profit from the earth. On the Sabbath, we especially care for the seed of eternity planted in our soul. The world has our hands. Our soul belongs to someone else. Can you picture it? Week after week, preparing your heart, entering into a moment in time where God is especially present and can transform who you are. As a habit, it changes the human soul. It allows it to remain steady and stable in a fast-changing, anxious world. I'm just painting the picture because there are other practices that do that. Some people meditate. Some people sit and study, but not just study for the mind, study that moves into the heart. Some people fast as a way to bring God to life within our souls. In fact, we're coming to Lent, and that tradition of giving something up for Lent, that's really based on fasting. I'm wondering if maybe this year, as we approach Lent, the beginning of March, I'm wondering if you all, any of you, feel called to choose a spiritual practice to step into for that period of time. You could tell one another, because that's why a community is needed. If you just make the conviction to yourself, it doesn't necessarily hold. If you make it to your wife, a little better chance. At least that's been my experience. The times in my life when I've meditated most regularly are when I've done so with Barbara, and she says, "It's time to sit down, Sam." I don't know what it is that might be good for you as you confront this pace of change and seek transformation from the presence of a loving God. But I'm hoping that you might consider making that choice, because we certainly need transformation in a world that has gone so mad. On the Sabbath, it is given to us to share in the holiness that is the heart of time, even when the soul is seared, even when no prayer can come out of our tightened throats. The clean, silent rest of the Sabbath leads us to a realm of endless peace, or to the beginning of an awareness of what eternity means. There are few ideas in the world of thought which contain so much spiritual power as the idea of Sabbath. Eons hence, when only shreds of our cherished theories remain, that cosmic tapestry will continue to shine. For eternity utters a day. How can that day become alive in your heart?